Welcome to Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and in this episode, we will explore the hygiene of Civil War soldiers and answer the question, where did they use the bathroom? In short, the answer is everywhere, but I will explain how sanitary efforts came about to deal with refuse within Army camps. We will mostly be looking at early war armies because the mass of humanity was a new concept to civilians and soldiers. No soldier before the war had served in an army larger than 10,000 men, which was the one that General Winfield Scott used to capture Mexico City with during the Mexican-American War. By July 1861, the Confederate Army stationed at Manassas Junction numbered 30,000 men, which was larger than the city of Richmond, Virginia in 1860, and by the next year the Army was twice the size and population than the Confederacy's capital. Speaking of large armies, Confederates were incredibly unfamiliar coping with urban life. By the start of the war, Richmond was the 25th largest city in the U.S. New Orleans was number 6, and Charleston, South Carolina was 22nd, and were the only other cities in seceding states that outranked Richmond. Barely one of every 25 Confederate citizens lived in cities, with 10,000 people or more. Immediately following the First Battle of Manassas, the 30,000-man army occupied 10,000 men per square mile, more dense than the 6,000 people per square mile of Richmond. Although the army would disperse along a 15-mile front by December 1861, the number of soldiers grew to 76,000 officers and men. Those numbers don't include the thousands of civilians who came to see loved ones, view the triumphant army, scavenge for mementos, or the thousands of slaves who accompanied soldiers to act as their servants. Urban Americans, by the time they reached adulthood, had become seasoned by surviving diseases and illnesses like mumps, chickenpox, measles, and typhoid fever. Rural Americans did not have this resistance, and since the overwhelming majority of the soldiers in the Confederate Army were rural, they were more susceptible to these ailments. With a sudden thrust into an urban environment in the form of the Army, disease ran rampant. Historian Joseph Glattard described it as a biological time bomb. A North Carolina soldier admitted, "It is a fact that the battlefield is far less to be dreaded than the sickness in camp." One Tar Heel unit in mid-August 1861 reported 800 sick out of a total of 1,100 men. With doctors in short supply early on in the war, healthy comrades were ordered to take care of the sick. One of the most rampant diseases was typhoid fever, which came from polluted food or water from human excrement. Not washing their hands before preparing food and not putting sufficient distance between privies and water supplies was how the majority of cases spread, and even after recovering, some soldiers could remain as carriers and continue to infect others. This type of disease spread from unsanitary conditions created by soldiers themselves and their placement in a high populated location in which they had never been in before. Sick soldiers crammed hospitals, but the medical staff was lacking. Commander Joseph E. Johnston assigned one soldier to act as a nurse per 10 sick comrades. The medical director for the Army sought to bring in slaves and free blacks to act as nurses, but this ran counter to Johnston's attempt to limit the number of logistical burdens to the Army, which created more refuse. In many respects, the hospitals were just as bad as the camp for the sick. For instance, the University of Virginia opened up many of its buildings to act as a hospital for the Army after the Battle of First Manassas. Once taken off the battlefield, which could be hours to days, the sick or wounded troops would wait in agony and transport by train in dirty cattle cars for 24 to 36 hours with no food or treatment. One observer wrote, "Men rolling about in their dirty clothes, not a change of clothes nor anyone to bathe their aching bones." The conditions within these early hospitals grew to such horrid proportions that a group of patients who felt they had been ignored and badly treated by surgeons petitioned Confederate President Jefferson Davis to dismiss great portions of the Army's medical team. They wrote, "Disease is wasting away the glorious Army of the Potomac. We have lost 10 times as many men by sickness as by warfare. They feared sickness would spread further with no additional means used to prevent the spread of the fearful pestilence. We humbly protest that 3/4 of the surgeons of the Army are wholly unfit for positions." As Joseph Glattard explained, the Confederate troops unwittingly created a sanitary nightmare for themselves. The best means of preventing illness was to select healthy campsites and to police camps rigorously. But these practices were neglected. In the early 1840s, a physician named John H. Griscom embarked on a path-breaking study of sanitary conditions for the laboring classes in New York City. Griscom blamed the high rate of disease on poor sanitary and living conditions. It took a few years to convince authorities, but northern cities began to clean streets, build sewage lines, remove waste, and in general concern themselves with proper sanitation. The same month that the war broke out, a group of Northerners formed the U.S. Sanitary Commission, based on a model in the Crimean War. The Sanitary Commission acted as an advisory and watchdog group to ensure that Union officials preserved the health and welfare of the men. By contrast, the South lagged far behind. Rural Southerners had little sanitation problems before the war and followed simple rules. Don't build an outhouse near the well, and don't let animals live in the house. We find sanitation problems in the immediate aftermath of the First Battle of Manassas. Armies were unprepared to care for the dead on the battlefield. They remained on the field for days, which attracted vermin, which in turn added to the spread of bacteria and viruses. Those illnesses forced soldiers to run to the bathroom more often, but they were unfamiliar with digging sinks to act as toilets and would often relieve themselves just outside a camp or defenses without covering it up. Rains then washed the waste down into streams and contaminated water supply. The medical directors within the Army called for better sanitary conditions, but the troops were lackadaisical toward abiding by those rules. The directors explained that if they did dig sinks, it was not at such a distance from camp as to prevent the deleterious effects of miasma naturally arising from the deposits. That brings up another interesting word for people of the 19th century, miasma. It refers to bad smells, which was what medical officials believed caused illness. One will find in numerous medical journals of the time about the attempt to stop miasma, and that means bad smells. Now, bad smells themselves do not cause illness, but what causes the bad smells can, like refuse. So they were on the right track, but the idea of germ theory was a few years away at this point. It took veteran commanders like Brigadier General Jubal early to whip regiments into shape. He not only provided guidance on how to dig trenches for the disposal of butcher's discards and how to cover them properly each day, but he also assigned an officer of the day for each regiment in his brigade the responsibility of inspecting the sites during that tour of duty. Early demanded written reports of all violations. He also directed officers to attend to sinks. If they caught soldiers not using them properly, officers were required such persons to remove all offensive matter to the sinks and keep the same in good order. Obviously, Early made sure the men under his care would stay healthy as possible. Veterans of the Mexican-American War knew tricks and would teach them to their men, but for the first year of the war, the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia lagged behind in health to the more urbanized Northerner. In summation, the horrible conditions brought upon themselves by a lack of hygiene only exacerbated the problem of dealing with waste. Sick soldiers would find no relief in camp or in hospitals. The Confederate Army did not come together as a fighting force with all the knowledge needed to transform civilians into soldiers. It was a learning process that had many casualties before they learned how to take care of themselves by cleaning up their camps. I hope you all enjoyed this video. Next week is an animated battle map, so if you are a patron, you can go vote on which battle will be covered. If you want to join, it only takes $1 and you can cast your vote and get to pick the next animated battle map. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.